All right, let's dive into the world of Elektron music gear. We're talking about the differences between the older and newer models, right?
Yep, a lot of people are curious about that.
So you want to know how Elektron's design philosophy has changed over time? What's special about those older models, and what makes the newer ones so interesting?
Yeah, and there's this whole thing about the older Electron gear being built like tanks. You see that everywhere in the source material.
Yeah, almost indestructible. Like those old school metal chassis. Are we talking spaceships or studios here?
Right, they definitely earn that reputation, like with the machine brat drum and mono machine. Those are built so tough. But you're right, the design approach is totally different now with the newer models.
What's changed? Did they switch from metal to plastic?
Well, not quite. It's more like they found a good balance. They still use super durable materials, but now it's also about being portable too. Take the Digitact, for example. It's a mix of strong metal and high-quality plastic. Sleek and modern-looking, but still tough.
Makes sense. Musicians today are moving between gigs and studios all the time. But speaking of the Digitact, I noticed that the source material mentions those larger color screens on the new Electrons. Were the old LCD screens really that bad?
Well, let's just say they had a certain pixelated charm, but really, those new, larger, high-resolution color screens are a huge improvement. And it's not even just about how they look. It really changes the whole experience of using the device, especially when you're navigating menus or visualizing parameters.
So it's about making the whole process smoother and more intuitive.
Exactly, especially for live performances when you need to see what's going on instantly. Being able to see those clear waveforms and tweak effects without squinting at tiny pixels makes a huge difference. It seems like music technology in general is moving toward more visual and intuitive interfaces.
Okay, we talked about the looks, but let's get into the sound of these machines, specifically how you actually make it on them. The Digitact has some really cool features for that, and the source material talks about granular synthesis and sample slicing. I'll be honest, granular synthesis has always seemed a little intimidating to me. Can you break that down a bit?
For sure. So say you've sampled a vocal on the Digitact. What granular synthesis does is it takes that vocal and chops it up into these tiny little pieces. We're talking milliseconds here. Then you can take those tiny pieces, they're called grains, and rearrange them however you want. You could stretch them out, reverse them, layer them on top of each other. It's wild.
So it's almost like you're not just rearranging the sound, you're basically deconstructing and rebuilding it at a microscopic level.
Exactly. It gives you so much control over the sound.
That's awesome. What about sample slicing? How does that work on the Digitact?
It's another way to get creative with your samples. Imagine you have a drum loop with a Digitact. You can isolate each hit in the loop, the snare, the kick, the hi-hat, and then rearrange them however you like. You can trigger them in any order. You can even play them melodically on the Digitact's keyboard.
So it seems like a lot of it comes down to flexibility and creative control, being able to really take your samples in a totally new direction. But what about actually composing entire tracks? The source material mentions that the Octatrack's multi-track sequencer really changed the game. What makes it so special?
It's all about breaking free from that linear way of thinking. With the Octatrack, you're not just stuck triggering patterns in a loop. You can actually build full arrangements. Think of it like having different sections of your song on separate tracks. You could have your verses, your choruses, your bridges, all laid out separately. And then the Octatrack lets you transition between them super smoothly, layer them on top of each other, even create cool variations within each part.
So it sounds like you have complete control over the evolution of the track.
Exactly. It's a completely different way of working compared to the older Elektron models. Those were really powerful, but sometimes you had to dig through a lot of menus to get what you wanted. With the newer Elektron devices, it feels like they really wanted to make that workflow more intuitive and immediate without sacrificing any of the depth.
So Elektron is all about breaking creative barriers, but I'm curious about the learning curve, especially with the older models. The source material kind of hints that they were a little tough to learn.
Yeah, you could say that. Those older Elektron boxes were amazing, but not exactly user-friendly. You really had to put in the time to learn them.
It sounds like you needed to earn it. How does that compare to the experience on the newer models?
Oh, it's a totally different experience now. Remember those big color screens we were talking about? It's a game changer. The way they've designed the menus and made it easy to find all the important stuff, it makes a huge difference.
That's great to hear. Who wants to spend all their time figuring out the interface? It's all about the sound, right? And speaking of sound, the source material talks about this cult following around how the older Elektron gear sounds. What makes those older models so unique?
Well, it's a few things, I think. The older models used lower sample rates,
Yeah.
right? And simpler synthesis methods, by today's standards, some people might even call it limited. But sometimes those limitations are what makes things sound interesting. There's a certain warmth and grit, sometimes even a little bit of unpredictability that's tough to recreate with newer tech.
So it's like they say, limitations breed creativity.
Yeah, exactly. Plus, there's that whole nostalgia factor, too. People still seek out those older models, especially for certain genres where that raw, kind of gritty sound is what they're looking for.
So how do the newer Elektron boxes compare? Have they managed to keep any of that classic character, or is it all clean and digital now?
Honestly, I think Elektron did a great job finding that balance. They definitely embraced higher fidelity. The newer models have those higher sample rates and bit depth, so everything is super clean and modern sounding.
Yeah.
But they've also got all these really cool sound design tricks and effects that can add a bit of that analog warmth or grit back in if you want it.
It's like having the best of both worlds then. You get that pristine digital sound, but you can still dial in the vintage vibe if you want. But even if it sounds incredible on its own, it still needs to work with other gear too. What about connectivity?
You're right, that's essential these days. The older Elektron gear mainly used MIDI, which isn't always ideal.
What's different now?
Well, the new Elektrons have it all. They've got built-in USB audio interfaces, so you can record straight into your computer, MIDI over USB, even CV Gate, so you can sync up all your old synths and drum machines with no problem.
That's amazing.